Our Planetary Moment, A Journey Through Cosmic Time. Part 1, Setting the Stage. There were no eyes to see it happen, and even if there was not yet any light for them to see, nor even any space in which to look. The universe was born out of an infinitely creative quantum womb, poised somewhere, or is it nowhere, between being and non-being. In an instant, since there was not yet any time for it to hesitate about its future, with a flash of warmth and light, the cosmic embryo began to grow. Though there is undoubtedly an organic integrity to space-time, perhaps grow is here a bit of an understatement. The universe began with a bang. From 10 to the negative 33 centimeters cubed, the smallest volume physicists can measure, the universe inflated to the size of a human being within 10 to the negative 32 seconds. To put this in perspective, it has taken another 13 billion years for the universe to grow by the same order of magnitude that it did in this initial fraction of a second. Our cosmic seed seems to have been in quite a rush to get its evolutionary adventure underway, as if it already had some glorious end in mind. That said, chance and accident have also undoubtedly left their mark on the history of our universe. It only takes a glance upward at the night sky to reveal the seemingly happenstance location of the formation of stars in space. To the untrained eye, we seem to be adrift in randomness. But we must look deeper. There is a certain fine-tuning at work beneath the surface that continues to baffle the scientists who study it. The rate of the universe's inflation had to be exactly right for stars to form, and under the pressure of gravity within these enormous sidereal masses, as Teilhard de Chardin describes it, unfolded a harmonic series of simple bodies spread over the notes of the atomic scale from hydrogen to uranium. The elemental music emanating from the core of these spheres made possible the formation of planets, and upon at least one, the emergence of life. The beauty and coherence of this process is evidence enough that our universe longs to express itself, and that some mysterious ordering principle is at work, pulling it toward greater complexity and deeper feeling. As cosmologist Brian Swimme puts it quite simply, the universe is about something. Still, if there be any doubt about the meaning of the music of the spheres, we need only consider the ears for whom they now sing, and the eyes whom, awestruck, now absorb and reflect upon their light. With the emergence of mind out of life and matter, the narrative arc of the universe becomes unmistakable. There is a story being told. It is no metaphor. The universe is struggling to be born again within human consciousness by learning all that it has done and loving all that yet remains to be done. Knowledge and love, these are the protagonists of our story. Each, the knowledge pursued by science and the love fostered by religion, have been essential in guiding the course of human history. It would be naive and irresponsible, however, to fail to mention how often these same guides have been our fiercest adversaries. With every increase in knowledge comes an increase in power. Often the latter overreaches the former, leading to the invention of technologies whose detrimental effects are only understood in retrospect. Similarly, the unifying impulse of love can be so strong that it blinds us to the evils committed in its name. It seems that what our species lacks is not knowledge or love, but knowledge of love. We don't yet understand, and so have been unable to take responsibility for the full extent of our mission on Earth. In the essay to follow, I will delve into my own heart-mind in search of clues concerning the way forward. As Teilhard reminds us, it is upon increased personalization, the internal deepening of consciousness on itself, that the emergence of a planetary Weltanschauung in which each of us cooperates and participates, depends. To help me imagine the future, I will also need to recollect and unpack the Western tradition that informs my metaphysics and cosmology. But before reaching into the past or to the future, let us come to grips with the present. Part 2, Facing the Challenge. For all of us alive today, the more than 7 billion human beings currently populating the Earth, the problems are obvious, but the way forward remains obscure. We are faced with an unprecedented evolutionary challenge. Never before has the universe been in a position to consciously choose the next chapter in its story. Nor have human beings ever been so anxious and uncertain about their collective future. Few remain who are not at least aware of the magnitude of the crisis. For most, it is a fact of daily life. The World Health Organization estimates that 2/3 of the world's human population is malnourished or starving. In the time it takes to read this sentence, someone, probably on the Indian subcontinent, will have died of starvation. The world wars of the 20th century, estimated to have killed nearly 100 million people, were apparently not enough to convert us to pacifism. Armed conflicts, each killing more than 1,000 people a year, continue to embroil our species in India, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, Pakistan, Mexico, and Sudan, and now on the European continent in Ukraine. Smaller conflicts over beliefs and resources wage in 29 countries across the world. This was in 2010. Issues of poverty and wealth distribution, racism, sexism, and religious intolerance don't even begin to round out the human extent of our planetary crisis. Sea level rise due to climate change threatens to redraw continental shores, creating tens of millions of refugees in the coming century. As if this were not bad enough, production of the very fossil fuels responsible for climate change has peaked, bringing the industrial economy we remain so dependent upon to the brink of collapse. But this crisis has more than a human face. Not a single ecosystem on Earth has been unaffected by our human presence. In total, 17,291 known species are currently threatened with extinction. This number includes 20% of mammals, 25% of reptiles, 40% of fish, and 70% of plants. Scientists estimate that the background rate of extinction is approximately 1 per million species per year. At present, this rate has increased by a factor somewhere between 100 and 1,000. Renowned biologist E.O. Wilson claimed in an interview with the BBC in 2009 that the rate could soar to upwards of 10,000 times the average rate by the year 2030. I could go on listing the social and ecological issues that our planet is confronting, but the only way to understand this crisis, so far as I can tell, is to interpret each separate issue as the symptom of a deeper sickness of soul. Humanity is experiencing the pains associated with every birthing process, but unlike the universe in its embryonic form, which had no time to hesitate, self-reflective human beings can become stuck. We can refuse to participate in this crucial evolutionary moment, whether due to fear or pessimism or ignorance. It is as though our greatest gift, our self-conscious freedom, is simultaneously our tragic flaw. It gives us the ability to step back from the immediacy of sensory and emotive experiences as if to understand them from outside. In short, it allows us to doubt. But in doubting our experience of the world, we become alienated from it. The true cause of our crisis is this alienated consciousness. Despite scientifically awakening to the full spatio-temporal extent of the universe, we seem to have forgotten that we are that very same universe. We are not outside it, not other than it. Or perhaps it is not despite this awakening to the immensity of space and time, but because of it that we feel so alienated from nature. Concerning the relatively recent discovery of the true dimensions of the cosmos, Teilhard de Chardin writes, "Leaving some dark prison, we are blinded by light. Emerging abruptly onto a high tower, we are overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. We experience the dizziness, the disorientation, the whole psychology of modern uneasiness related to its abrupt confrontation with space-time." Teilhard acknowledges the difficulty of coming to terms with this spatio-temporal awakening, but suggests our initiation into the universe's true dimensionality remains dangerously incomplete if we do not also acknowledge its evolutionary trajectory. Modern scientific knowledge has resituated the human in relation to the rest of the universe, which is a far vaster and more difficult to imagine place than it was prior to Copernicus. But evolution is the thread that ties it all together, placing the human being, if no longer at the center of a static cosmos, at least at the creative edge of cosmogenesis. So what is required of us now that we have woken up to this grand evolutionary process? I believe we must come to recognize that individual self-consciousness and the arbitrary freedom of choice that it wields is not an end, but merely a brief developmental moment in the ongoing noogenic process that is already transforming us in order to bring forth a new human for a new earth. Each of us is being called to become something more, a new kind of person, at home with and in love with others and with the rest of the community of life on Earth. We are searching for a new collective identity, but to find our true humanity, we must overcome the narrow-minded individualism so characteristic of our Western civilization. Before attempting to investigate and, if I'm lucky, instigate the movement of consciousness beyond the isolated ego, I will take a brief detour to explore the role the West has played in world history. I will also unpack the ideas of a few major thinkers, especially as they are relevant to the evolution of modern Western consciousness. Part 3. Remembering the past. The West, for better or worse, has, according to Teilhard, led all peoples from one end of the world to the other to put the hopes and problems of the modern Earth in the very terms in which it has succeeded in formulating them. Similarly, Sean Kelly credits the West with having played a catalytic role in the emergence of our still developing planetary era. The European colonial conquests during the course of the past 500 years, violent as they were, have resulted in the economic and biocultural co-evolution of every race on Earth. All people are now inextricably netted together in a complex human fabric that is weaving itself around the planet. This is not the place to speculate about what could have been had the West not been so bent on world dominance. Post-colonial critiques continue to expose the latent Eurocentrism of our modern geopolitical scene, compelling us to overcome ongoing injustices. But it is hard to deny the impact the Greco-Judeo-Christian impulse has had on our now planetary civilization. If we take a Hegelian view of history, it may be easier to understand how the evils of war and conquest have worked to bring forth higher forms of goodness than would otherwise have been possible. The cunning of reason, as Hegel famously refers to it, assures that spirit's universal goals are met, despite the seeming chaos and contingency of particular world historical personalities and events. Hegel's philosophy of history allows us to see how conflict is necessary for more ideal possibilities to manifest themselves on Earth. Evolution could not occur, after all, unless strife and opposition were met along the way. War, according to Heraclitus, is the father of all things. But as Alexander the Great exclaimed on his deathbed, perhaps prematurely at the time, but no longer so today, there are no more worlds to conquer. There is now only one world. The evils of war have exhausted their dialectical magic. binding humanity inextricably into a single biocultural and economic whole. More war can now lead only to collective ruin. A year before his death, in 323 BCE, in an oath given before thousands of his Macedonian and Persian subjects, not far from modern-day Baghdad, Alexander is alleged to have said the following: "Now that the wars are coming to an end, I wish you to prosper in peace. May all mortals from now on live like one people in concord and for mutual advancement. Consider the world as your country, with laws common to all, and where the best will govern irrespective of tribe. On my part, I should consider all equals, white or black, and wish you all to be not only subjects of the Commonwealth, but participants and partners. As much as this depends on me, I should try to bring about what I promised. The oath we made over tonight's libations hold onto as a contract of love." It seems that love works in mysterious ways to bring about the unity that it seeks. It is as if, during the course of the historical period, this hidden spiritual force has been driving individual human beings to sacrifice themselves for a future they could only dimly imagine. Alexander's call for peace and participatory planetary governance still awaits realization, but it becomes more apparent every day that history's hidden goal is precisely such a contract of love. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before imagining this still nascent future, we must understand the core religious, scientific, and philosophical ideas that have shaped the Greco-Judeo-Christian impulse mentioned above. In discussing the biblical stories to follow, I aim only to draw out their archetypal meaning, leaving the question of their physical reality aside. As Carl Jung reminds us, physical is not the only criterion of truth. There are also psychic truths which can neither be explained nor proved nor contested in any physical way. Though the exact date remains unknown, sometime around the 13th century BCE, a prophet by the name of Moses led the Hebrew people out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea and settling temporarily at Mount Sinai. It is here that Yahweh revealed the Ten Commandments, which to this day represent the essence of moral law for many in the West. But there is an earlier revelation I want to draw attention to, that which first inspired Moses to lead his people out of slavery and toward the Promised Land. While Moses was still a shepherd tending his flock near Mount Sinai, according to the biblical legend, he came upon the angel of the Lord in a burning bush that somehow was not consumed by the flames. The voice of the Lord called to him, "Moses, Moses, here am I." Covering his face, as he was afraid to look upon God, Moses then received his divine mission to lead the Jews out of Egypt. He asked the Lord his name, to which the response was, "I am that I am." This cryptic statement is significant because Moses, at one time a member of the Egyptian royal family, was an initiate into the Egyptian mystery schools, whose secrets can be summed up with the phrase, "Know thyself." This call to attain self-knowledge would later inspire Socrates and Plato, and indeed every genuine lover of wisdom since. Moses' encounter with the I Am represents the beginnings of a mutation in human consciousness from tribal to individual identity. But as I will explore below, it seems this mutation will remain incomplete until the esoteric meaning of Christ's incarnation is understood. Moses was still too afraid to look upon the face of the Lord, which, with the benefit of 3,000 years of consciousness evolution, we can safely say was his own. Nonetheless, his powerful experience allowed the Hebrews to become, according to Richard Tarnas, to experience themselves as the chosen people. The revelation of the I Am led this particular community to believe that they existed in a unique and direct relationship to the one creator of the world and director of history. This was an extremely novel perspective in comparison to the polytheistic religions of other tribes at the time. The Hebrew notion of human history being fulfilled in a future era of universal peace and justice, brought about by the coming of a messianic figure, is described by Tarnas as the divination of history. It set the stage for Jesus, who many centuries later fulfilled the prophecy of Moses by announcing that he was Christ, the Son of God. Throughout the Gospel of John, Christ refers to himself as the I Am revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. But this time, it was not a chosen few who would have this mystery revealed to them, but the entirety of humanity. Much of the Western world's subsequent history can be understood as the playing out of the great code embedded in the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. Birth represents the original Garden of Eden, where all was idyllic and humans and nature remained undifferentiated. Death, and the torture that preceded it, represents the fall, wherein the knowledge of good and evil fractures humanity's original participation in the earthly paradise, making us aware of our nakedness and giving rise to the sense of homelessness and alienation that the consciousness of our age has come to know so well. The resurrection represents the promised redemption of the world through the restoration of all that was lost as a result of the fall, though with the added benefit of a consciousness not present with the original innocence. Not only would humanity return to paradise, it would know it was in paradise. The Western imagination, whether consciously or not, seems to be playing out this code upon the stage of world history. Hegel's entire philosophy of history is modeled after the great Trinitarian code of Christianity. Indeed, it may not be too much of a stretch to suggest that the very concept of history, implying as it does the narrative structure of beginning, middle, and climactic end, is a Judeo-Christian invention. Prior to this innovation, most cultures conceived of time as cyclical. The West is unique in its conception of time as providential. Between the time of Christ and the birth of the modern era around 1500 CE, much of great significance occurred, including the fall of Rome and the rise of the Catholic Church. But for lack of space, I will focus for the remainder of this section on three modern thinkers whose ideas continue in subtle ways to shape our worldview: Copernicus, Descartes, and Kant. The timely motions of the planets were a sign to ancient peoples that the universe was a divinely ordered whole and a likeness of eternity. But by the time of Copernicus, the geocentric Ptolemaic model used to predict their orbits was growing more and more cumbersome. Epicycle upon epicycle was required to save the appearance of the motion of the planets and the sun around the Earth. Copernicus was asked by the papacy to clean up the mathematical mess so that more accurate calendars could be made. While researching possible solutions, Copernicus came upon ancient Greek manuscripts discussing the undeveloped hypothesis of a heliocentric solar system. Working out the mathematical details, he came to realize that the appearance of the moving sun and stars was deceptively created by the Earth's own movements. The long-reigning medieval cosmology, classically depicting the universe as a series of perfect heavenly spheres encompassing the stationary Earth, began to fall apart. The Copernican shift of perspective, writes Tarnas, can be seen as a fundamental metaphor for the entire modern worldview, the profound deconstruction of the naive understanding, the critical recognition that the apparent condition of the objective world was unconsciously determined by the condition of the subject, the consequent liberation from the ancient and medieval cosmic womb, the radical displacement of the human being to a relative and peripheral position in a vast and impersonal universe, the ensuing disenchantment of the natural world. This radically disorienting cosmology prefigured and perhaps required the ontological and epistemological developments that Descartes and Kant would later articulate. Descartes recognized, as Plato had millennia earlier, that sensory appearances were often deceptive. He needed a new method of arriving at certain knowledge that would allow the burgeoning sciences to continue to unveil the secrets of nature. He began by going into his own mind, doubting the very existence of the external world, including the existence of other people. He was left with only his own thinking activity, and realized that in the very act of doubting itself, he had found something which could not be called into question. The entire world may be an illusion, but in thinking of this possibility, I, undoubtedly, am. Or as Descartes famously formulated it, I think, therefore I am. The discovery of the cogito led Descartes to develop an ontology of two substances: a thinking substance or soul, which is autonomous and has access to clear and distinct ideas, and an extended substance or matter, which is mechanically determined according to mathematical laws. Human consciousness was thus alienated from the natural world and even from the physical body housing it. Kant remained a thoroughly Cartesian philosopher, but his motivations were a bit different. Inspired by the success of Newton's mechanistic picture of nature, Kant was nonetheless uneasy about the steady march of scientific understanding. If all material motion could be understood to behave according to deterministic mathematical laws, what kept these laws from applying to embodied human beings as well? Kant saw very clearly that the freedom of the human soul could no longer be taken for granted. In his most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, Kant convincingly argued that the mechanisms science thought it was discovering in the natural world were in fact a necessary result of the inherent structure of the human mind itself. Our relation to space and time, for example, is not a result of our empirical encounter with them in a pre-existing world. A quick phenomenological look at our experience reveals that we do not see space, only colored surfaces, nor do we see time, only movement. The mind, Kant realized, does not passively receive an already ordered world. Rather, forms of intuition, like space and time, and categories of understanding, like causality and substance, must be presupposed as necessary conditions for any human experience of the world to be possible. We know reality, in other words, only as it appears to us after being filtered through the mind's pre-existing categories. Kant referred to his epistemological reorientation as a second Copernican revolution, as objects were now understood to revolve, so to speak, around the subject, their appearance always already shaped by the latter's cognitive lenses. By limiting science to knowledge of appearances, Kant was able to protect traditional religious ideals like freedom, God, and immortality from being dispelled, though these could not be known with any certainty either. He famously wrote in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason that he had found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. But in so doing, he also further alienated consciousness from nature, which became an unreachable thing in itself. As Tarnas describes it, Kant's revolution was fundamentally ambiguous. Man was again at the center of the universe, but this was now only his universe, not the universe. Kant's uneasy dualism between the phenomenal and the noumenal worlds inspired a generation of philosophers in Germany, most notably among them Schelling and Hegel, to strive to find a way to reunite the human mind with nature and the divine. As Kelly writes, for the idealists, instead of the machine, as in Newton's science, the organism and life become the root metaphors for the cosmos as a whole. Kelly also points out that, in these thinkers, much emphasis was placed on the idea of development and evolution. For them, the overall drive of the cosmos is toward the production of increasing complexity of organization as the vehicle for the eventual emergence of self-reflexive consciousness. it is these more organic and evolutionary cosmological perspectives that may provide a way forward, as they awaken us, again, to our embeddedness in an ensouled and purposeful universe. Let us now turn our eyes to the future to see what that purpose might be. Part 4, Envisioning the Future. All this emphasis on purpose in general, in the universe and in history, cannot be separated from my personal consciousness. I must admit that I am unable to imagine a universe so absurd as to have no reason for being, just as I am unable to live my own life in the absence of spiritual ideals. I have tried to doubt the teleological picture of the universe, but there really are no viable alternatives that are coherent with and adequate to my actual experience. The universe is about something. The warmth and light with which it began its story manifest themselves as the love and wisdom at work throughout human history. The culmination of history, its end, can only be brought about when every human soul has come to know love. Then the world will be transformed from the inside out. Or perhaps it has already been transformed. Perhaps, as Teilhard writes, Omega already exists and is at work right here and now. In the face of all the Earth's current ills, I am unable to lose hope in the underlying logic of the historical process. I must, at this point, interrupt the linear flow of this essay to offer a stream of consciousness prose poem, written late one night around Easter of the year 2010, as an attempt not only to envision the future, but also to fully embrace the divinity of the present. There is a logic to the historical process, I do not doubt, but this logic is dressed in mythopoeic parable, seeming at first to be obscure. To understand the meaning of history, we must participate in the realization of its end. This requires a certain turning about of the mind, a metanoia. Poetic language is one way to instigate such a mental turning. On this night, like any other, the gospel reveals its light, shouts the good news, and becomes an open secret. It is simple in its complexity. We are each and all the many eyes of one God, and in dying, we live this truth eternally. The gospel is now open because man, through history, has been brought to his utmost extremity, crucified and flayed bare beyond all conception. History has ended. The world and all of its hells are already over. Only heaven remains. This secret will be forever retold. The gospel here and everywhere is the very mouth of God, the breathing presence of divinity that I know only through my communion with you. Man's innermost recesses have been exposed. His most ungodly horrors and humiliations have been spread before the witnesses of his trial. Their eager eyes, like entirely amoral eagles, whose only wish was to feast on the delight of spirits adrift in the wind of their own wondrous and self-indulgent melodies. How quickly the world gets lost without wisdom. How empty even the music of the spheres can seem to sound, unless in each of the seven is discovered the common harmony, the most secret and the most well-known, the always and undying source of the ever-renewing breath of eternity. Only here, at the utmost edges of human life, does the infinite gain entrance, and can the holy truly pour into the life of mortal souls. What appears in me is merely the other end of you, the love who through evil became my own enemy. Evil is the inverse of love, the dismemberment of the one, but in being destroyed, the one can only be forever renewed. The good news is now known by everyone. We can only love one another because we are not other than one another. Spirit is the undulating mystery that brews between our patient and modest human breaths, overflowing in the words we speak to share our souls. What secrets can I keep from you, who know me as clearly as I see myself? There is nowhere to hide from the light of God. It reveals everything. It reveals all to everyone at once. And yet, there is something in the light that remains concealed. The true source of wisdom, the holiest of holies, is hidden within nature's most laborious of labyrinths, to this day remaining a mystery even unto itself. Know thyself, which means also love thy enemy. In each of us is the all. The one is none other than you and I. Knowledge truly is of good and evil, and unless in love we are able to remember the good expressed in our mortal nature, we die without having recognized the divinity of our ever-living, moving moment. There is no eternity but what is here and now, and in this unending surprise, the world is created forever anew out of its own ashes. The good news is now an open secret. It seems paradoxical to say that the good news that reveals the meaning of human history is an open secret. If it were open, why would it remain also a secret? Grasping this paradox, I believe, is crucial for humanity's future on Earth. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is reported to have offered a series of cryptic parables to a great multitude that crowded around him on the beach. At one point, his disciples asked him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" Jesus answered that the multitude had not yet been granted knowledge of the mystery of the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, he said, I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. More paradoxes. Seeing that sees not, hearing that hears not. What could this possibly mean? To grasp the subtle meaning of what has been said above, it must be placed in the context of the evolution of consciousness. Has history any real significance, asks Owen Barfield, unless, in the course of it, the relation between creature and creator is being changed? The evolution of consciousness for Barfield is a continuous movement from immediate or original participation in the meaningful rhythms of the natural world towards an increasingly alienated null point, wherein a contraction of human consciousness from periphery to center reduces all the wisdom of the cosmos to an isolated ego housed somewhere within the sinews of the human brain. The human brain is the organic labyrinth nature has labored for eons to produce, the tabernacle meant to house something so much more holy than the null point now lost within it. But this is not the end of the movement, according to Barfield. It is, however, where nature's labors, at least in the human, are at their end. From this point forward, it becomes our own responsibility to evolve into what Barfield calls final participation. While for original participation the heart was enlivened from a source outside itself, namely the still spiritually imbued natural world, final participation requires that the heart burn from within, irradiated by the light and warmth of Christ, the I Am, incarnate within each and every human being. In an apocryphal text written sometime in the 2nd century, Jesus is reported to have said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you. Only he who knows himself can find it." The paradox of an open secret may now be understood. The evolution of consciousness has transformed human beings from unconscious participants in the course of natural events into conscious creators of history. The divine is no longer to be found outside ourselves. Divinity is hidden in the only place our eyes could not see, nor our ears hear. Having thus realized our own divinity, we must ask ourselves whether we ought to shrink from the notion that we are to share the responsibility of maintaining an earth, which it has already, it seems, been given into our hands to destroy. The future of the earth and humanity depends upon our gaining the inner strength and imagination required to reinvent ourselves. The new story of the universe as a living, self-organizing system has made Copernicus all but obsolete, and the null point reached in the philosophies of Descartes and Kant continues to be challenged by a flurry of embodied ontologies and participatory epistemologies emerging to meet the needs of our time. Whether we like it or not, as Coleridge writes, in our life alone does nature live. Our presence has already forever changed the face of the planet. But I have more faith than all the world can contain that we will be born again and come to live in peace on earth. What else could human history be than the toilsome work of preparation required for our cosmic seed to finally flower and bear its fruit?